It's 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. You're in a meeting. Someone's phone buzzes. Then another. Then another. Within 30 seconds, every device in the room is lighting up. Ransomware notices are spreading across screens throughout your organization. The security team immediately starts their incident response protocol. They make the call, shut down the network, contain the threat, stop the bleeding. Now what? The security team has done their job. They've cut the lines and stopped the bleeding. But as the smoke clears, a new crisis emerges. The infrastructure team is standing on one side of the room. The security team, they're on the other. They're all looking at each other like strangers. Sure, they pass each other in the hallway, but they've never actually fought a war together. And in the middle of a total shutdown, that lack of trust is more dangerous than the malware itself. This is when organizations discover that having a disaster recovery plan isn't the same as having a cyber recovery plan. I'm Robb Boyd, and this is Worldwide Technology Presents Research. We've reached the fourth and final priority in our series, Business Continuity and Cyber Recovery. We spent the last 3 episodes talking about how to modernize, how to automate, and how to build for AI. But today is about the reality that all that work is a target. And as Doug explains, the plan you have to survive a flood or a power outage is almost useless when the threat is already inside the house. Doug Wong is a technical solutions architect at Worldwide Technology, specializing in cyber resilience and data protection. 12 years in security. He sees the gap that exists in most organizations between how they think about disaster recovery and what cyber recovery actually requires. The most common starting point Doug encounters isn't a technical failure, it's an organizational one.
When we think about security and resilience, we have a lot of customers that, over the past, let's say 15, 20 years, right? We've really kind of developed a lot of those, what I would call silos within organizations. A lot of it has to do with just separation of duties. Infrastructure and ops folks kind of focus on their own little world. They deal with things in the data center. The security side of things, securities will take their tact with regard to their purview. They'll also kind of sometimes, tell the infrastructure and ops folks, hey, just mind your own business, like stick to your side. And this is one of the things we really see when we think about resilience for an organization. If an organization is going to be resilient, they really need to have the aspect in looking at the big picture and understanding where their cross collaboration happens, where they rely upon each other, right? If you thought about something along the large scale cyber incident that impacts an organization and you got a ransomware notice on, starts coming across people's screens, that's an all hands on board type of event.
That kind of crisis response assumes everybody already knows what everyone else does. It assumes that relationships and trust are already in place. But Doug has walked into rooms where neither is true.
We've seen customers that have lived through that and really have to help them through the backside of understanding how the cross collaboration works. And because sometimes I go and talk to a customer and we bring a couple of those different teams together and they haven't really talk to each other other than, crossing paths in the hallway. And they don't really know what the other team does on the, security side versus the infrastructure and ops and vice versa. Not understanding where their pathways cross. And especially if you suffered a cyber attack, what's that going to look like? How do I go back and forth? If I don't have a relationship with the other side of the house and my colleagues, then where's that trust built, right? Am I going to be building that at the time of recovery? And what does that mess look like? Because, everybody's fully stressed in those kind of situations. And it's going to really create a big gap and challenges, with all the additional anxiety and stress that comes with dealing with something like that. If you haven't established and kind of, built those relationships, ahead of time.
Building relationships in the middle of a crisis, that's a nightmare. And it happens more than you'd think. Here's what makes cyber recovery fundamentally different from traditional disaster recovery. With DR, you're thinking about natural disasters, hardware failures, power outages, events that are external to your systems. You have a secondary data center, you've invested in redundancy. You flip a switch and you fail over. With cyber recovery, the threat is inside the house. The response often requires actions that feel counterintuitive.
When we think about that disaster recovery, you have a secondary data center. So you start to take things for lack of a better term, for granted, in that, I have a lot of infrastructure that's ready to go. It's warm or hot, and I can just flip a switch and all of a sudden I'm failing over to my alternate data center. When we think about that cyber recovery and cyber resilience aspect in a differentiation from a disaster recovery incident, when we think about something that hits us at a large scale cyber incident, we're talking about possibility. I got to unplug my entire network, right? So now I have a whole another set of problems. Once I have to go down the pathway of unplugging my network or cutting users off from accessing various parts of the network, we really start to narrow the field of, hey, well, how would I start to even think about turning it back on?
In a traditional disaster, you flip a switch and move to site B. It's a transition. But in a cyber attack, you aren't transitioning, you're amputating. You're unplugging the entire network. You aren't failing over to a warm site. You're standing in a dark room with a box of matches, trying to remember how to build a fire from scratch.
Or what happens if I have a reliance on some SaaS application for some of my security posturing as well? If I turn up my network, now I don't have access to those tools as well. So how do I do some of the forensic and analysis to figure out, did I discover the bad guy? Have I fully gotten it out? Can I actually start the process of recovery? And then the other big piece is when we think about cyber recovery, same thing. When we think about bringing down the network and bringing down all these core operations, how do I bring those up from ground zero, right? This is that taking for granted. When I do a DR instance, I have a secondary instance of AD, DNS, my, info blocks and things like that. Those are all running already in my secondary data center. So all I'm doing is, flipping a switch to swing over from A to B from that perspective. Whereas in a cyber attack, now I need to think about things like, what are my tier 0 applications that I have to get up within the data center before I can even think about starting to recover an application or a business function and all the parts and pieces that go along with that.
Tier 0 applications, the foundational infrastructure that has to exist before anything else can come up. And this is where Doug encounters what he calls the chicken and egg scenario, one that organizations discover almost always too late.
So now we need to think about things like additional recovery dependency mapping, right? There may be an order of operations of things that have to happen. We also encounter things like, in this day and age, organizations have become more and more efficient. And a great example here is we also create things like a chicken egg scenario, right? So we've experienced this with a lot of customers where we go down the pathway and we start the exploration and we discover things like, hey, I've got all these things running on VM. And a great example here is, you're standing up and controlling your network switches. I had a customer that, they're running Cisco switches. So Cisco ICE is a primary method to go in and instantiate and lay down configurations on switches. Same thing with firewalls, with Panorama. Yeah. So if your Cisco ICE and your Panorama sit on a VM and I've gone through a cyber attack and I've shut down the network, well, how do I start to get my network back up? Yeah. Because now the network configuration and the tooling there sits on a VM. Well, I can't turn on a VM if I don't have the network. Yeah. So now I've backed myself into a corner.
It's the ultimate irony of modern IT. We've spent 20 years virtualizing everything for the sake of efficiency. We put our network controllers on VMs, our security tools on VMs, our identity management on VMs. It's elegant. Right up until the moment our network goes down and you realize that the keys to the room are locked inside the room. Doug calls it the starting seed, the physical anchor you need to bootstrap a ghost ship.
So you need to think about, do I have alternative pathways to licensing and fixed licensing that can apply to something like that? Do I need to instantiate some physical servers as well that are part of my restoration plan that give me my starting seed so that I can get something like Cisco ICE or Panorama back up and running in that example, right? Because then those are going to be the tools that our core teams are going to use to facilitate getting the core network back up and then going over and talking to the VMware guys. And then we're going to start to stand up vCenter and ESX hosts. And then I can get a additional instance of Cisco ISO Panorama there and then distribute those out. Similar to domain controllers, right? We think about AD and that capability, same type of thing. You need a starting seed to get the first instance up. And then, yes, you can replicate it or, vMotion copies of that out to additional VMs once that VM infrastructure is really up and running.
This is the trade-off. For 20 years of efficiency, we've created circular dependencies that only become visible when you have to rebuild from the ground up. To break that cycle, you need a very specific kind of insurance policy, which brings us to the dependencies themselves. In the first episode of this series, Eric Dalalo described application mapping as part of infrastructure discovery, understanding what's running and what it connects to. Doug applies that same concept to recovery. Here, getting it wrong doesn't mean a delayed refresh, it means a stalled recovery.
Oftentimes, organizations are very good about identifying what my A1 applications are, right? So I may have an application that does my billing as an example. However, oftentimes they overlook the things that may be in current tier 2 or tier 3, lower down the stack, that are critical feeds or speeds to the tier 1 application properly functioning.
Yeah.
So now we create some of those gaps. If we don't think about the other pieces, just because I can get the core, number 1 application up and running, if I don't have its critical speeds and feeds that come from other secondary and tertiary pieces, then it's not going to function properly. And then I'm not going to get that business function really back up and running as well.
Your tier 1 application might come up successfully. All its components are running. But if it can't talk to the tier 2 system that provides critical data, or it can't send transactions to tier 3 system that processes them, you haven't actually recovered anything useful. That's why application dependency mapping becomes essential.
Most of the time, I mean, yes, you can drill down and keep going with the business impact analysis to gain those other insights. However, we often find that until you do an application dependency mapping, a lot of the time, the people that are the application analyst, for example, doesn't necessarily know all the parts and pieces that it touches from a secondary, tertiary nature, and all the things that maybe potentially feed it. And so when you run a tool set to actually mine that data and gather that in order to create that mapping, that's when you really start to see that exposure and that understanding of, hey, we actually have to think about these 15 applications that actually are part of my A1, my number 1 on the top 10 list kind of thing.
15 applications, not one. That's what the map looks like when you run the tools that actually mine the dependencies. And the threat environment is evolving in ways that complicate recovery further.
One of the things that we're seeing more and more popularized by the bad guys out there today is AD-based attacks, right? As simple as going and calling your help desk and saying, hey, I'm Doug Wong and I need to get my credentials reset. Oh, and by the way, my phone number somehow got canceled. I got a new phone number. Right? And so now, but I need my MFA credentials for my Okta reinstalled and instantiated on my new phone, right? So these are actual ways that we're seeing the bad actors go about this. And so it's also you need to start adjusting some of the foundational things that your help desk may do to address something like this. So does the help desk get the person on video and say, hey, the guy that I'm talking to, he looks like Doug Wong based upon me going into the system, and it's a live thing. Hey, Doug, can you also show me your driver's license and hold it up next to your head, right? So things like that are some of the process pieces that we need to start to instantiate so that you can't go about, via deepfake.
Social engineering attacks powered by AI. Deepfakes calling the help desk. The threat environment is moving faster than most security teams can adapt to. The research outlines a clear path to resilience, but there's a psychological hurdle at step 3. It's the fear of starting. We're used to checking compliance boxes and passing audits, but Doug knows that a past tabletop exercise can be a dangerous illusion if you've never actually tried to eat the elephant.
A lot of times we have the deer in the headlights moments from a customer perspective. And so we really try to break it down into smaller chunks and phases, much like anything that's, overwhelming. How do you break it down into something that's consumable, something that's achievable, that I can say, hey, I actually reached some level of completion. I can check that box and then I can move on to the next thing, right? And so that comes back to, when we talk about kind of the chewing through an elephant. How do I eat through an elephant? I got to take a first bite.
Take that first bite. Start somewhere. Build momentum. Learn from what works and what doesn't. Most organizations think they've already done this. They have disaster recovery plans. We talked about those. They test those plans. They check those compliance boxes. The testing, though, isn't usually what it needs to be.
A lot of customers do write, a run book, and they do a tabletop exercise. But until you actually put the rubber to the road and actually run through it in real life, you won't discover, the speed bumps or the twists and turns or the loop-de-loops you got to do from that perspective. Things you might have to circle back to, right? You may be able to create some automation pathway for certain parts of that operation, and you still have to insert manual configurations and touch points within that automated process. And so without actually going through that exercise, you won't discover those breakpoints and challenge areas.
A tabletop exercise is a conversation in a conference room. A recovery is a knife fight in a dark alley. You can have the most beautiful run book in the world, but it won't tell you what happens when a licensing server fails or a DNS entry goes missing. Those loop-de-loops only show up when the rubber actually meets the road. But you can't take down production to test cyber recovery. This is where isolated recovery environments become essential.
We've seen this in the security arena where our security teams have things like clean rooms. And so they're able to go through and validate security profile on things. And so this is really an extension of that concept to create an isolated recovery area that is segregated from our primary network. By taking a copy of things offline, we have the ability to then validate and test in that vacuum without impacting production operations. Of course, the pathway to get things back to full production, that's got to be part of the test as well. And so that's where you can subdivide and create additional space within that recovery environment to facilitate doing things like that, thinking about, hey, I can get things up to a certain extent, and then I need to vMotion, for example, back to a production workload where that will allow me to scale to, production capacity.
This is why the concept of a cyber vault is so critical. You need a sandbox where you can set the world on fire without burning down the business. It's exactly what we built the Advanced Technology Center to handle. It's a $1 billion laboratory where we can replicate the chaos of a 100 vendor ecosystem and find the roadblocks before they become your reality. Because in a recovery, the biggest hurdles aren't the individual tools, it's how they talk to each other.
One of the biggest things is as the depth and the reach that Worldwide has is we're a number one partner with so many of these major OEMs in the space. And even if we're not a number one partner, we still have great investment from, all these other partners as well. And so we're able to bring their multitude of offerings and hardware, their software into the ATC. And we're able to test a lot of that integration as well between each and every one of them. A lot of times it's a one-off, two-off situation where we're testing two things together versus the potential complexity of a customer's ecosystem that might have 50 or 100 different OEMs in their environment. But we're figuring out what are the tricks, what are the things that are roadblocks or speed bumps that we run across as we start to integrate those things. And then we use that knowledge to then bring on to our next engagement.
Every integration point is a potential failure point during recovery. Testing those integrations in a vendor-agnostic environment reveals problems before they become crisis-level issues. If you're an organization moving from we have a DR plan to we can actually recover from a cyber attack, where do you start?
So we can come in and do some discovery with our customer when they know that this is a challenge they want to address. And then we can really break it down into, hey, you already got these key functions, right? So you already have DR testing that you do on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. And I already test these 10 applications. And yes, most of the time it's, testing an application in a silo versus testing an application bundle. Because the complication of, you think about the additional parts and pieces that feed and speed, or maybe, take outputs from your core application, those absolutely become important. But most of the time we're not testing in that manner. We're doing tests in a very succinct manner and not throwing those curveballs in to our testing. So Of course we pass those tests, and so we can use, our customers use that and they check the box and go back to governance and compliance and say, hey, we did our test of application A. It was able to recover. We were able to bring up the application server and connect to the database, and boom, right? And that may be, 3 or 4 VMs and a database server. So versus looking at an ecosystem that's 50 or 100 VMs and 3 or 4 or 5 databases, right? Those are really what large customers deal with, from just how we've architected things over time and our interreliance on a lot of different, systems within the environment.
Testing a single application versus testing an application bundle with all its dependencies, that's the difference between checking a compliance box and actually being prepared.
The key documentation pieces, oftentimes this takes the form of runbooks, as well as a overall cyber incident response plan. So the response plan is different than just the incident response piece of it, right? Just the security piece, but thinking through, right? The cyber team may come in, we may have brought down the network. So what do we stand up first? Well, I need to start getting some switches up and running and lay down some core network. I may reuse my old IP space. What if I can't? What if I need to re-IP everything? What does that mean to the organization? Does that mean I need to, go in and, impact DNS across whatever I had before and create new, right?
Yeah.
That could be its own mess from that perspective. But that's one of those things that until you go through an exercise and start to do this, and you can expose a lot of this from a tabletop perspective, but you're not going to recognize it until you throw these various use case scenarios, at the situation.
Let's go back to that Tuesday morning. The notices are spreading, the screens are locking up, but this time there's no panic. Not because the situation isn't dire, but because the muscle memory is there. The infrastructure and security teams aren't introducing themselves for the first time. They're executing a playbook that they've already run a dozen times in the vault. This is the capstone of the Data Center Priority Series for a reason. You can refresh your hardware, you can build a private cloud, and you can deploy the most advanced AI in the world. But if you can't recover those investments from a bad Tuesday, you haven't actually built a resilient business. The research for all priorities, from infrastructure refresh to cyber recovery, is available right now at WWT.com. Priority 4 is your guide for breaking down the silos and building that starting seed your organization needs to bootstrap a ghost ship. Use the framework, run the dependency maps, and build those relationships now. Because the middle of a crisis is the absolute worst time to find out your plan was just a checkbox. I'm Robb Boyd. Thank you for watching.